I want to invite our first guest on the show for this week from the National Council of Women of New Zealand. Suzanne Manning joins us. Suzanne, good evening and thank you for joining us.
Kia ora, and it's a pleasure.
You got your eye on the funeral? Is that your cup of tea?
Yes and no. The family are in the other room, so if the internet gets a bit wonky, it's just because there's heavy in the other. But what you were saying about the Queen, there was one thing about the Queen that she did. What she did, she actually blazed quite a few trails for women just by being the only woman in a room and making sure that she wasn't run by the staff around her, but that she was the Queen and therefore she was the one that was going to be calling the shots in her realm. So, whatever you think about the monarchy, I think the Queen played her part well.
So do you think that she's, I'm trying to think about like a good example of females, of womanhood, of someone who's blazed a path for women in the last, well, she's, I guess, 70 years. There are things from within her lifespan that you could look to and go, man, she broke some ceilings, some glass ceilings there for women for sure. And if there are there any that come to mind?
Not specific events or anything, but just back in the 50s when she was the only woman in a lot of the rooms. And, I've watched The Crown, I think, but it was about getting her opinion to be taken seriously by the men in the room, because it's all very easy to sort of come in and go, oh, well, she's a woman because this is the 1950s. Why she'll be easy, but she was never easy to persuade to do. She had her own mind and she knew it, and she was very good at it. So.
Well, listen, thanks for joining us tonight. The reason we've brought you on board is on this day in 1893, in New Zealand, women win the right to vote. When the governor, Lord Glasgow, signed a new electoral act into law, New Zealand became the first self-governing country in the world in which women had the right to vote in parliamentary elections. So actually, not just a historic day, but a massively historic day all around the world. And we've asked you to come on board and have a bit of a chat about this. And I wonder, could you give us a bit of the background to what happened and why New Zealand did this? And I'll just say one thing before I open the floor to you, is because, I mean, maybe to my shame, I'm not very well informed on it. And you hear things around the place as to why women got the vote and who, quote unquote, gave women the vote. There's a common refrain I've heard by many that said, well, women didn't really want the vote back then because it meant things like conscription and various responsibilities that came with it. So, you are someone who hopefully can give us all the facts and figures. So educate us. Tell us about how it came to pass, why it came to pass, and what happened when women got the right to vote in New Zealand.
Okay, so I'll try and do a potted history because people actually write whole books on this. And where you say that, women thought that, well, I'm sure there would have been some women in the country who thought that, because the women don't think alike. There are different people with different ideas. But the vast majority were not of that opinion. The vast majority were of the opinion that they wanted to vote. And you saw it with the number. I was hearing today that the suffrage petition that they got presented to Parliament as evidence that women wanted to vote, I can't remember if it was 25,000 signatures or 23,000 signatures or something like that. But in terms of percentage of the populations, that would be like getting 500,000 signatures these days. Wow. That's how many were prepared to put their name down on it. And then they had 6 weeks between the 19th of September and the election. They had to get women enrolled. And they got, I believe, 80% of eligible women were enrolled in that 6 weeks. And more eligible women voted in that election than eligible men.
Wow.
So the idea that women didn't really want the vote is not borne out by those sort of figures.
To help you out with the numbers here, I've just looked up nzhistory.govt.nz. The petition that was submitted to Parliament on 28th July 1893, it contained the names and addresses of about 24,000 women aged 21 years or older. So 24,000, they're saying.
Right. Yeah.
What was the sort of political and organizing process for this, Suzanne? Because like we often talk about the theory and concept of political change on the show, and then the practicalities and this sort of thing. What was what in the lead up to the petition? I'm sure there was a lot of organizing and that sort of thing going on.
Oh yeah, they were massively good at organizing, and that's part of the reason that they were successful in what they did. I mean, all around the world, they were talking about increasing the number of people who could vote. They were already changing from just landowners to everybody, and so this was a big thing all over the world in terms of men, anyway. So the women jumped on board with this. There were a lot of women. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU, were a prime driver here in Aotearoa. They had a visit from, and you can look her up because I forget her name too, but from the organizer from America came and did a tour in New Zealand, and everybody was like, yep, this is what we want to do. The women in particular were very anti the drink that was being real disruptive for their family lives. So it was mostly the men that drank, but not totally. And there was a saying that there were two ways to die. You could drink yourself to death, or you could die as a result of you could drown as a result of drunkenness. So there was a lot of anti the drink problem. So the WCTU had this idea that if women could vote, they could pressure the men to pass better liquor laws. So that was a starting point. But then there were a lot of people who were actually more interested in gaining the vote anyway, just because they were strong-minded women who wanted to be heard. And so they, through the Women's Christian Temperance Union, had unions up and down the countries, and that was a basis, but they spread out from there. They had other women's groups were starting at the same time. And so they just kept connecting, and Kate Shepherd was one of the forefronts, but there was a whole lot of people. But she was somebody who was very articulate and did a lot of the fronting of the campaign. Mm-hmm. But they were just in contact with themselves up and down the country. And women are great organizers. They just sort of it was committees, and nobody was worried about, I can do this or I can't do that. They just went for it. Another thing, I was just up in Whanganui today. There's been a suffrage window unveiled in the district council chambers up there that the NCW Whanganui branch commissioned, which is really cool to see other women who were involved in the suffrage movement being promoted. So there was Margaret Bullock, Jessie Williamson, and Ellen Ballance. And that's the photo, that's the window that's up there, and that's the branch. And the thing with Ellen Ballance, so Mr. Ballance was down in Parliament, and he was pro-suffrage, basically because his wife was telling him he was going to be pro-suffrage. And when you look at the stories, there was a lot of that sort of stuff. There was a lot of men who were responding to their women folks' desires. So what was happening was there was a lot of political pressure coming from women through the men as well. The women tended to be more invisible, but it was happening anyway. So there was a lot of that sort of thing going on, because of course, if you're going to get a suffrage law passed through Parliament, you have to get the men to pass it. So you have to get a whole lot of the men to actually agree. And then there were some things that worked against them. Like one man thought that women were such weak vessels that they needed representation, so that they could be, they needed to have a say, just because otherwise who else was going to look after them? And so he was pro-suffrage, or it might have been actually the pro-representation, which came in 1919, because he thought women were so weak. And I think all the women thought, a stupid argument, but we'll take your vote. Thank you very much. Not going to worry about that.
Hey, Suzanne, I'm wondering, do you know, like, the vote that happened that was only men for Parliament, and then the next vote that happened that had women voting in it, were the results very different? Like, was there a different kind of politician elected? Did it make any difference?
No.
Or did it stay pretty much the same because the system was already set and then women had to slide into the current system?
Well, when you're talking about voting, so when I say the vote for suffrage, that was in Parliament. Okay, so it was a male-only Parliament, so that was the voting there. But if you talk about the election that had happened before that, the male election, and yes, the men were a bit worried about how the women would vote, but actually you get a whole raft of women and they have a whole lot of different opinions, and so it pretty much comes out the same. And I mean, the same people were standing for Parliament. Women weren't allowed to stand for Parliament until 1919. And so you still had the same people to vote for. So actually, the election result was just more people voting, but the actual result was pretty much the same.
I was always thinking as well, I mean, would it be fair to say in 1893 that sort of New Zealand led the world in women's rights? Is that a fair analysis to draw from that? Like, how would we have been deemed? Like, if it was 1893, would we be now what some people would like to say the woke country of the world because these Sheilas have now got the vote? How would we be deemed by the rest of the world at that time? And were we at the forefront, the pointy end of women's rights then, or is this a very small aspect of women's rights and there was a lot we weren't doing?
Back in 1893, we still had sort of two systems going. We had Māori Indigenous culture, and we had the British colonial culture coming in. And so in terms of colonial culture, we were ahead. We were doing well. The National Council of Women, we started in 1896 because the suffrage women hadn't finished yet. And they sort of transformed into this. But also the International Council of Women started up in America around 1888. And they started out with getting rid of corsets and big dresses that you couldn't move in. So that was some of the first things they were doing. While they were worrying about that, which we worried about a little bit too, but we were getting the vote. So we were held up pretty much as forerunners, this sort of thing. But if you go back to Māori society, before colonialism, women had a lot of say in the whole running of Māori society. So introducing colonialism was actually, for Māori women, a backward step, because suddenly they had this patriarchy in a way that was different to what they had. So they had a lot of they were silenced and made invisible, because that's how British women were seen.
Yeah, right.
So for them it was a backward step.
It's such an interesting kind of to think about, Māori women and how they can be with the warrior men on the front line, participating in various aspects of it, versus then thinking about the English woman sitting at home, needle pointing and that sort of thing. So there is conversations going on in the chat tonight about how to, and I'm paraphrasing a bunch of comments, how did suffrage actually help Māori women, and what happened there? Was this something that really just helped colonial women and nothing else, or where do Māori women fit in the story of this anniversary?
So at that point, it was, things were still sort of integrating, or integrating. Colonialism was still taking over. There's Meri Te Taimanga Kahia is one of the prominent Māori suffrage figures. And so around about this time, they were, or just a bit later, they were setting up Te Kautahitanga, the Māori Parliament. But of course, it was set up as a Māori version along the same lines as the British colonial Parliament. So it's not how Māori would have done it pre-colonial times, but it was in response. And so, of course, because it was set up like that, it was without women. But the first chair, speaker, premier, I'm not quite sure, of the Parliament, Meri Te Taimanga Kahia was his wife, and she addressed that Māori Parliament, which the first woman to address Māori Parliament, and no British woman had addressed the colonial Parliament. So that was quite a big thing. And she said, actually, wahine Māori should be given the opportunity to elect the representatives of this Parliament. And she said, we should have the right to sit in this Parliament. Now, she was pushing for stuff that the British colonial women just, that was too beyond the pale. They were only looking at getting the vote. But actually being able to stand for Parliament themselves, they thought that was a step too far. Not for Meri Te Taimanga Kahia. She was like, this is what we need. And she was doing it. But that Parliament didn't last too long. It was basically the Māori MPs and Māori seats within the British Parliament. And so when women got the vote, wahine Māori got the vote along with them. But did it change much? I don't know how much it really even changed for the colonial women. I mean, there were so many things that later on, I mean, like, it wasn't until 1919 that we were allowed to have women MPs. And it wasn't until 1933 before we had our first woman MP, and that was from the by-election. And in fact, there was somebody who had predicted back in 1919, he says, it's fine, you've got women MPs now, but until you get proportional representation, it's not going to change. And it was so right, so right. Yeah, so for a long time, yes, we got the vote, and then it's sort of like, oh, well, done now. Stop. Just sat back, did nothing for ages.
George, have you got anything else you want to ask about suffrage? I've got one more question that I want to ask Suzanne about, but I don't want to cut her off.
I wonder what's been the sort of, it was, I guess, born out of, stuff around alcohol and obviously, humans' right to representation and the governing system and all that sort of stuff. I wonder what, as we got all the way to the 80s, and I think that's when you said the National Council of Women was started. Was that right? In the 80s?
1893.
Oh, the National Council of Women was started back then as well.
So the International Council, 1888, the Suffrage, 1893, National Council of Women, New Zealand, 1896.
Oh, right.
All in a few years.
Well, what I was going to ask is, I guess, more what the organisation that you represent, what they see has been the issues in maybe, maybe the last 50, 60, 70 years, maybe beyond representation in Parliament or whatever it might be.
Like at the first conference of the National Council of Women, they called for equal pay.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
I think, you know what? We're still calling for equal pay.
Mm.
And sure, there's been improvements and changes. So what has been granted when we talk about sort of just same job getting the same pay, and even that's not quite the case when you look at some places. But we're also now looking at different occupations which are women dominated or men dominated, so equal pay is a huge thing. Safety is a huge thing. The right to be at a decision-making table, wherever that decision-making table is a huge thing. Women's health to be taken seriously, because I think we got onto that sort of topic last time I was here. We were sort of
Yeah, I think we were
women's
Roe versus
reproductive
Wade.
bodies.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's right. And it's sort of like, oh, let's not talk about this because it's women's bodies. Actually, yeah, let's talk about this because we need it. So those are some of the big things. One of the big things at the moment is the increase in misogyny online and the harassment and the bullying. We have heard quite a few people from this, with these elections, who are not standing for councils, women who are not standing for councils, not thinking of elections next year because they don't want to face the abuse. And so where the trolls are actually trying to silence women, it's happening too many places. So there is actually a bit of a groundswell, and it's one of the things that we're trying to really pick up is to how do we find ways of stopping that, because women shouldn't be silenced.
Hey, just bouncing off the back of what George says, I've sort of a similar sort of question, but if in 1893, 1890s, we were sort of looked on by the world as a bit of a forefront, a bit of a leader, how is New Zealand considered now in the eyes of the world when it comes to women's rights?
We're still pretty good. The last UN, they look at a range of things, or is it not OECD? I think it is the UN, put out a ranking, and we were at 1.6, and then we dropped down to 9th, and I think we're up to 3rd or 4th or something like that. So generally people see us as good in a lot of things. But you do have to drill down on that. So like we keep saying with pay equity. So there is a gender pay gap. The gender pay gap, but it's not just gender, it's also ethnicity. So if you are a Pacific woman, you get paid a lot less, not just a wee bit less, but a lot less. If you're a disabled woman, you get paid a lot less. So whereas you might say the average is pretty good, what we keep pointing out is, yes, but look down at the details.
Very good. Hey, well, look, thank you for joining us tonight, Suzanne. Dr. Suzanne Manning from the National Council of Women of New Zealand. I mean, for the National Council of Women, is this sort of like a holiday? Is this like a Christmas Day celebration for you guys? Big things going on? Is it, so it's been a good day for you guys?
It has been a big day. It was also a big day last Tuesday. We had a parliamentary event where we celebrated 125 years of being National Council of Women. It's actually our 126th year, but COVID does things to people. But we celebrated 125 years last year, so last week. So these 2 weeks have been massive for us.
Cool.
And this is topping it off. Thank you very much.
Yeah, save the best till last. Good save there, Suzanne.
Yeah.
Hey, thank you for joining us. I'm sure we'll be in contact again, and I'm sure we'll talk about more issues in the future. Loved having you on board and appreciate you giving us some time.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. See ya.